Sometimes the most heroic acts happen in the quiet moments when no one is watching. Sometimes doing what's right costs you everything you've worked for. And sometimes, when the world seems to turn against you for showing compassion, an entire military force stands up to remind everyone what honor really means. This is the story of Sarah Martinez, a nurse who lost her job for 30 minutes of kindness, and how her act of humanity sparked a movement that would restore faith in doing the right thing. Sarah Martinez had always believed that healing went beyond medicine. As she walked through the automatic doors of St. Mary's Regional Medical Center, on what would become the most consequential Tuesday of her career, she carried with her the same philosophy that had guided her through 12 years of nursing. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the hospital corridors, and the familiar sounds of beeping monitors and hushed conversations filled the air like a symphony she had grown to love. At 34, Sarah had seen it all. She had held the hands of dying patients, celebrated with families welcoming new life, and worked countless double shifts during the pandemic when the world seemed to be falling apart. Her colleagues respected her, not just for her clinical skills, but for her unwavering compassion. Patients often requested her specifically, drawn to her warm smile and the way she made even the most frightening medical procedures feel manageable. That morning started like any other. Sarah checked her assignment board and saw she would be covering the emergency department, filling in for a colleague who had called in sick. The ED was always unpredictable, a place where human drama unfolded against a backdrop of medical urgency. She tied her dark hair back in a practical ponytail, adjusted her navy blue scrubs, and headed to the nurse's station to get her morning report. The charge nurse, Margaret Thompson, was a stern woman in her 50s who ran the department with military precision. She had been at St. Mary's for over 20 years and took pride in maintaining order and efficiency. As Sarah approached, Margaret barely looked up from her paperwork.
"Martinez, you've got beds 7 through 12 today. We're already behind schedule, so keep things moving," Margaret said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had dealt with too many administrative headaches.
"And remember, the new administrator is making rounds today. Mr. Carver wants everything by the book, no exceptions." Sarah nodded, understanding the subtext. James Carver had been hired 6 months earlier as the new hospital administrator, brought in to cut costs and improve what the board called operational efficiency. Since his arrival, the atmosphere at St. Mary's had become increasingly tense. Nurses were expected to see more patients in less time, and any deviation from strict protocols was met with swift disciplinary action. Several experienced staff members had already been terminated for what Carver deemed inefficient use of hospital resources. The morning progressed smoothly enough. Sarah treated a construction worker with a deep laceration on his forearm, comforted an elderly woman experiencing chest pains, and helped stabilize a teenager who had been in a minor car accident. Each patient received her full attention despite the pressure to move quickly. She had learned to work efficiently without sacrificing the human connection that she believed was essential to healing. Around 10:30, the ambulance bay doors burst open with the urgency that made everyone in the department look up.
2 paramedics rushed in wheeling a stretcher carrying a young man in military fatigues.
Even from a distance, Sarah could see the pain etched across his face and the way he was favoring his left leg. His uniform bore the distinctive insignia of the United States Marine Corps. "What do we have?" "Doctor," Richardson called out as he hurried toward the incoming patient. 22-year-old male Marine took a fall during training exercises at Camp Pendleton, the lead paramedic reported breathlessly. Possible fractured tibia, definitely sprained ankle. He's been in significant pain for the past hour. Vitals are stable, but he's asking for something for the pain. The Marine's name was David Chen, and as Sarah helped transfer him from the stretcher to the examination bed, she could see the effort it took for him to maintain his composure. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his jaw was clenched tight against the pain. Despite his obvious discomfort, he managed to say "thank you, ma'am" when Sarah helped position him more comfortably on the bed. Dr. Stereo chose to stay at home at the scene of the church. Richardson quickly examined the injured leg, ordering X-rays to confirm the suspected fracture. As they waited for the radiology team, David's pain seemed to intensify. He gripped the side rails of the bed, his knuckles white with the effort of staying silent. Sarah had seen enough injured service members to recognize when someone was pushing themselves beyond their limits to maintain military bearing. "The pain medication should help once we get you sorted out," Sarah said gently, checking his vital signs. "You're going to be fine." David nodded, but his breathing was becoming more labored. "Ma'am, I don't want to complain, but it's getting pretty bad. Is there anything?"
His words trailed off as Margaret Thompson appeared at the foot of the bed, clipboard in hand.
She took one look at the situation and frowned. "Dr. Shaddy." Richardson is with another patient and we're backed up. This is going to have to wait. Sarah felt her heart sink.
Hospital protocol required a doctor's order before administering pain medication, but she could see that David was approaching his breaking point.
The X-ray results would take at least 20 minutes to process, and Dr. Richardson was indeed dealing with a cardiac emergency in the next room. By hospital standards, David's injury wasn't immediately life-threatening, which meant it would have to wait.
"Ma'am, I understand you're busy,"
David managed to say, his voice strained.
I've never felt anything like this before. Sarah looked at the young Marine, seeing not just a patient but someone's son, someone who had dedicated his life to serving his country. She thought about her own brother, who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before coming home changed by what he had experienced.
She thought about all the service members she had treated over the years, how they rarely complained even when they were suffering.
The hospital pharmacy kept a limited supply of over-the-counter pain relievers at the nurse's station for situations exactly like this.
It wasn't prescription medication, just the kind of ibuprofen anyone could buy at a drugstore, but it would at least take the edge off David's pain while they waited for the doctor's orders.
Technically, nurses weren't supposed to administer any medication without a doctor's direct order, but Sarah had seen colleagues bend this rule in emergency situations before.
She looked around the busy emergency department. Margaret had moved on to deal with another crisis, Dr. Pennis SIRL. Richardson was still tied up, and the other nurses were all occupied with their own patients. David's breathing was becoming more shallow, and she could see him fighting back tears of frustration and pain. Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She quietly retrieved a standard dose of ibuprofen from the nurse's station and returned to David's bedside.
"This will help with the pain while we wait for the doctor," she said softly, handing him the medication with a small cup of water.
"Thank you," David whispered, the relief evident in his voice even before the medication could take effect. Sometimes, Sarah knew, just knowing that someone cared enough to help could be its own form of medicine. For the next 30 minutes, Sarah stayed close to David's bedside, monitoring his condition and providing comfort while they waited for the X-ray results. The ibuprofen helped reduce his pain to a manageable level, and his vital signs remained stable. When Dr. Richardson finally arrived with the X-ray results confirming a hairline fracture, he was able to examine David properly and prescribe appropriate pain management.
"You'll need a cast and some crutches," Dr. Richardson explained. "The fracture should heal completely in about 6 weeks. You were lucky it wasn't worse." David nodded gratefully. "Thank you, doctor, and thank you," he said to Sarah, "for staying with me. It meant a lot." As David was being discharged with his new cast and crutches, Sarah felt the satisfaction that came from knowing she had made a difference in someone's day. She had seen him go from agonizing pain to manageable discomfort, from isolation to feeling cared for. It was moments like these that reminded her why she had become a nurse in the first place. She had no way of knowing that James Carver had been watching the hospital administrator, had been making his rounds, observing staff efficiency, and looking for any deviations from protocol. He had witnessed Sarah administering the over-the-counter medication without a doctor's order, and in his mind, it was a clear violation of hospital policy. It didn't matter that the medication was harmless, that the patient was suffering, or that the outcome was positive. What mattered was that rules had been broken. As Sarah finished her paperwork for David's discharge, she noticed Carver approaching with Margaret Thompson close behind. The expression on both their faces told her immediately that something was wrong. "Nurse Martinez," Carver said, his voice cold and formal, "I need to see you in my office immediately." The walk to the administrative wing felt endless. Sarah's mind raced through the events of the morning, trying to understand what could have warranted such a serious summons. She had followed all protocols, treated her patients with care, and maintained the high standards she had always held herself to. Carver's office was a stark contrast to the warm, lived-in feeling of the hospital wards. Everything was pristine and organized, from his expensive desk to the diplomas hanging precisely on the wall behind him. He gestured for Sarah to sit in one of the uncomfortable chairs facing his desk while he reviewed a file. "I witnessed you administering medication to a patient without a doctor's order this morning," he began without preamble. "This is a direct violation of hospital policy and potentially puts both the patient and this institution at serious legal risk." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "Mr. Carver, the patient was a Marine who was in significant pain. I gave him over-the-counter ibuprofen to help him while we waited for the doctor. It's the same medication anyone can buy at any pharmacy." "That's not the point," Carver replied sharply. "The point is that you acted outside your scope of practice and violated clearly established protocols." What if that patient had been allergic to ibuprofen? What if he had been taking other medications that could interact? What if he had sued the hospital? "I asked him about allergies and other medications," Sarah protested. I followed all the safety checks.
He was suffering, and I was trying to help.
Your job is to follow orders and protocols, not to make independent medical decisions,
Carver said, closing the file with a sharp snap. This kind of rogue behavior cannot be tolerated in a properly run medical facility. Sarah felt the world shifting beneath her feet. 12 years of dedicated service, countless lives touched, hundreds of patients helped, and it was all being reduced to a single moment of compassion that was somehow being painted as reckless endangerment.
I understand your concerns, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. But I would make the same decision again. That young man was suffering, and I had the means to help him safely.
Isn't that what we're supposed to do?
Carver's expression grew even colder. What you're supposed to do is follow the rules that keep this hospital running efficiently and legally. Your employment with St. Mary's Regional Medical Center is terminated, effective immediately.
The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She sat in stunned silence for a moment, unable to process what she was hearing. Fired. After 12 years of exemplary service, she was being fired for showing compassion to a suffering Marine. You can collect your personal belongings from your locker, Carver continued, already reaching for another file. Security will escort you out of the building. Your final paycheck will be mailed to your home address. The next hour passed in a blur.
Sarah cleaned out her locker while a security guard watched, her hands shaking as she packed away the personal photos, the thank you cards from grateful patients, and the small mementos that had made her workspace feel like home. Her colleagues watched in shocked silence as she was escorted through the hospital corridors she had walked confidently just hours before.
Margaret Thompson followed her to the exit, her expression unreadable. I'm sorry, Sarah, she said quietly when they reached the parking lot. For what it's worth, I think you did the right thing. Sarah nodded, unable to trust her voice.
She sat in her car for a long time after Margaret went back inside, staring at the hospital where she had spent so much of her life, where she had grown from a young nurse into an experienced professional. The building looked the same, but everything else had changed.
As she finally started her car and pulled out of the parking lot, Sarah had no idea that David Chen had been waiting in the hospital lobby to thank her again before his ride arrived. She didn't know that he had overheard Carver and Margaret discussing her termination, or that he had asked for her full name and contact information. Most importantly, she had no way of knowing that David Chen had friends, lots of friends, and that those friends were about to hear a story that would make them very, very angry. The drive home felt surreal.
Sarah kept replaying the morning's events, trying to understand how an act of kindness could have led to such devastating consequences. She thought about her mortgage, her student loans, the bills that would keep coming even though her income had just disappeared.
She thought about starting over at 34, trying to explain to potential employers why she had been terminated from her previous position.
But mostly she thought about David Chen and whether she would make the same choice again if she could go back.
As she pulled into her driveway and sat staring at her modest home, she realized that despite everything, the answer was yes. She would rather lose her job than lose her compassion. Some things, she believed, were more important than rules. She had no idea that by the end of the week, the entire country would know her name. David Chen sat in the passenger seat of his buddy's pickup truck, his casted leg propped awkwardly against the dashboard as they drove back toward Camp Pendleton. The pain medication the doctor had prescribed was finally working, but his mind kept circling back to what he had witnessed in the hospital lobby. The conversation between the administrator and the head nurse had been brief but clear enough. The nurse who had helped him, who had shown him kindness when he was suffering, had been fired for it.
"You're quiet, man," said his friend Marcus, glancing over from the driver's seat.
Pain getting to you? David shook his head slowly. Mark, you're not going to believe what just happened back there. As they drove through the California countryside, David recounted the entire story.
He told Marcus about the fall during the training exercise, the excruciating pain during the ambulance ride, and the long wait in the emergency room. He described how Sarah Martinez had stayed with him, how she had given him something to help with the pain while they waited for the doctor, and how much that simple act of kindness had meant to him.
"And they fired her for helping you?" Marcus asked, his voice rising with disbelief.
"For giving you Advil? That's what I heard them saying,"
David confirmed. "She lost her job because she helped me when I was hurting. Mark, I've never seen anyone work harder to take care of people. She was checking on other patients even while she was waiting with me. She's exactly the kind of person you want taking care of you when you're at your worst." Marcus was quiet for a moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter. Like David, he was a Marine, part of a brotherhood that valued loyalty, sacrifice, and standing up for what's right. The idea that someone had been punished for showing compassion to one of their own struck at the core of everything they believed in.
We need to do something about this, Marcus said finally.
Like what? It's not like we can get her job back. Maybe not, Marcus replied. But we can make sure people know what happened. We can make sure everyone understands what kind of person she is and what kind of people fired her.
When they arrived back at Camp Pendleton, word of David's injury had already spread through his unit. The Marines looked after their own, and several of his fellow soldiers had gathered in the common area to check on him and hear about his trip to the hospital.
What they heard instead was a story that ignited something deep within them. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez had served 3 tours overseas and had seen enough suffering to last several lifetimes. When David finished recounting what had happened to Sarah Martinez, Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "Let me get this straight," he said, his voice measured but intense. "This nurse risked her career to help you when you were in pain, and some pencil pusher fired her for it?"
"That's exactly what happened, Sergeant." Rodriguez looked around at the dozen Marines who had gathered to listen to David's story.
He saw the same anger and disbelief in their faces that he felt in his chest. These were men and women who understood sacrifice, who had put their lives on the line for people they had never met. The idea that someone could be punished for showing basic human compassion was antithetical to everything they stood for.
"What's this nurse's name again?" Rodriguez asked.
"Sarah Martinez. She worked at St. Mary's Regional Medical Center." Rodriguez pulled out his phone and started typing. "Not anymore, she doesn't, but I think it's time the world learned about Sarah Martinez." What happened next was a masterclass in the power of military networks and social media. Rodriguez started with a simple Facebook post, sharing David's story and expressing his outrage at how Sarah had been treated. He tagged several of his Marine buddies, asking them to share the story if they thought what had happened was wrong. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within an hour, the post had been shared dozens of times. Marines from Camp Pendleton began adding their own comments, expressing support for Sarah and anger at the hospital administration. But the story didn't stay within the base. Military families, veterans, and civilian supporters began picking up the story and sharing it further. By evening, the post had been shared over 1,000 times. Local news stations began picking up the story, reaching out to David for interviews. The narrative was simple and powerful. A dedicated nurse had been fired for showing compassion to a wounded Marine. In an era when many people felt that basic human decency was becoming rare, Sarah's story resonated deeply. Sarah herself was unaware of the growing storm. She had spent the day in a state of shock, calling family members to tell them what had happened, updating her resume, and trying to figure out her next steps. The reality of her situation was beginning to sink in. She would need to find new employment quickly, and the job market for nurses who had been terminated was challenging, even with her experience. Her phone had been buzzing with notifications throughout the day, but she had assumed they were just the usual social media noise and hadn't paid attention. It wasn't until her sister called that evening that she began to understand what was happening.
"Sarah, are you seeing what's happening online?" her sister asked, her voice excited and concerned. "What do you mean? There's a story about you going viral."
"Something about you getting fired for helping a Marine?" Sarah felt her stomach drop. "How do people know about that?" "Apparently the Marine you helped is telling everyone what happened. Sarah, there are thousands of people sharing your story. They're calling you a hero." With trembling hands, Sarah opened her Facebook app and was immediately overwhelmed by the number of notifications. Friend requests, messages, and tags were pouring in faster than she could process them. The original post from Sergeant Rodriguez had been shared over 5,000 times, and countless people were adding their own comments expressing support for her and outrage at the hospital. As she scrolled through the messages, Sarah began to cry. Not from sadness this time, but from overwhelming gratitude. Strangers from across the country were reaching out to offer their support, to share their own stories of compassion in healthcare, and to express their belief that she had done the right thing. "Thank you for showing that there are still good people in the world. Read one message. My husband is a veteran, and your story brought me to tears. Thank you for caring," read another. "I'm a nurse too, and you're the kind of colleague I'm proud to work with," wrote a woman from Texas.
The messages kept coming throughout the night.
Veterans shared stories of nurses who had made a difference in their own lives. Healthcare workers expressed solidarity with Sarah's difficult situation. Parents wrote about wanting people like Sarah to be there if their children ever needed medical care. But the story was far from over. At Camp Pendleton, Sergeant Rodriguez and his Marines were just getting started. "This isn't enough," Rodriguez told the group that had gathered in the common area the next morning. Sharing a story online is good, but this woman lost her job for helping one of us. We need to do more. Corporal Lisa Thompson, a logistics specialist who had been following the stories spread online, looked up from her laptop. Sergeant, the local news wants to interview David about what happened.
And there's a reporter from the San Diego Union Tribune asking for more information about the nurse.
Good.
David, you up for talking to reporters? David nodded without hesitation. If it helps Sarah, I'll talk to whoever wants to listen. Over the next few days, David found himself in front of multiple television cameras, telling his story to local and national news outlets.
He spoke about Sarah's professionalism, her compassion, and her dedication to patient care. He described the pain he had been in and how her simple act of kindness had made an unbearable situation manageable.
She didn't have to stay with me, David told a reporter from CNN. She didn't have to risk her job to help me feel better.
But she did it anyway, because that's the kind of person she is. And now she's being punished for it.
That's not right. The interviews were powerful because David was so clearly genuine in his praise for Sarah.
This wasn't a scripted or coached response. It was a young Marine speaking from the heart about someone who had helped him when he needed it most. His sincerity came through in every word, and viewers responded to it.
Meanwhile, at St. Mary's Regional Medical Center, James Carver was beginning to realize that he had made a serious miscalculation.
His office phone was ringing constantly with calls from reporters asking for comment on Sarah's termination. The hospital's main number was overwhelmed with calls from angry citizens demanding that Sarah be reinstated.
The hospital's Facebook page was flooded with negative comments and one-star reviews. We need to control this narrative, Carver told Margaret Thompson during an emergency meeting.
This is getting out of hand.
Margaret had been watching the coverage with a mixture of admiration for Sarah and concern for the hospital's reputation. Maybe we should consider reinstating her, she suggested.
The coverage is making us look heartless.
Absolutely not, Carver replied firmly. If we back down now, it sets a precedent that employees can ignore protocols whenever they feel like it.
We'll ride this out. The news cycle will move on to something else in a few days. But Carver had underestimated both the power of the story and the determination of the Marines who had adopted Sarah's cause. As the story continued to spread, it began attracting the attention of veterans organizations, nursing associations, and healthcare advocacy groups. Each group brought their own networks and their own platforms, amplifying the story even further. The American Nurses Association issued a statement supporting Sarah's actions and calling for a review of hospital policies that prevent nurses from providing basic comfort care. Veterans of foreign wars, chapters across the country began organizing letter-writing campaigns to the hospital board.
Military families started planning a protest outside St. Sorrent
Mary's Regional Medical Center. Sarah found herself thrust into the center of a national conversation about healthcare, compassion, and the sometimes conflicting demands of policy and patient care.
Davies, and Davies.
Reporters were calling constantly, asking for interviews and comments. She was invited to appear on national news programs to tell her side of the story.
Initially, Sarah was reluctant to participate in the media attention. She was a private person who had never sought the spotlight, and the intensity of the coverage was overwhelming.
But as she read more of the messages of support and heard from other healthcare workers who had faced similar situations, she began to understand that her story was about more than just her own circumstances. "This isn't just about me," she told her sister during one of their daily phone calls.
There are nurses and doctors all over the country who are dealing with administrators who care more about liability and cost-cutting than patient care. Maybe if people hear my story, it will help other healthcare workers feel supported when they have to make difficult decisions. So Sarah began accepting interview requests, always making sure to emphasize that her goal wasn't revenge against the hospital, but rather a desire to advocate for compassionate patient care. She spoke eloquently about the challenges facing healthcare workers, the importance of treating patients as human beings rather than just medical cases, and her belief that sometimes doing the right thing requires taking calculated risks.
I knew there might be consequences for what I did, she told a reporter from ABC News.
But when I saw that young Marine in pain, I couldn't just stand there and do nothing. He had already sacrificed so much for his country, and I could help him with something as simple as an over-the-counter pain reliever. I would make the same choice again.
Her interviews were powerful because of her obvious sincerity and her focus on patient care rather than personal grievances.
She didn't attack James Carver or the hospital administration personally. Instead, she spoke about systemic issues in healthcare and the need to maintain compassion even within institutional constraints.
As Sarah's story continued to gain national attention, something unexpected began happening at hospitals across the country.
Nurses and other healthcare workers started sharing their own stories of times when they had to choose between strict protocol adherence and patient compassion. Social media filled with accounts of medical professionals who had bent rules to comfort patients, provide emotional support, or address urgent needs while waiting for official authorization.
The conversation was evolving from a single incident to a broader discussion about healthcare priorities and the human element in medical care.
Medical ethicists weighed in on the balance between patient safety protocols and compassionate care. Hospital administrators found themselves defending policies that seemed increasingly out of touch with public expectations.
At Camp Pendleton, the Marines were watching the story's evolution with satisfaction, but they weren't finished yet. Sergeant Rodriguez had been in contact with Marines at other bases, sharing Sarah's story and coordinating a response that would demonstrate the military's appreciation for her actions.
She stood up for one of us when she didn't have to, Rodriguez explained to a group of officers who had gathered to discuss the situation. Now it's our turn to stand up for her. What they were planning would surprise everyone, including Sarah herself. The morning sun cast a golden glow over Sarah Martinez's small apartment as she sat at her kitchen table with her laptop, scrolling through yet another flood of supportive messages. It had been 5 days since her termination from St. Mary's Regional Medical Center, and the story had taken on a life of its own. What had started as a local news item had become a national phenomenon, sparking debates about healthcare policy, worker rights, and the value of compassion in medical care.
Sarah's phone rang, displaying a number she didn't recognize with a California area code.
Over the past week, she had received hundreds of calls from reporters, producers, and well-wishers, so she had learned to be cautious about answering unknown numbers.
"Hello, this is Sarah," she answered tentatively.
"Ma'am, this is Sergeant First Class Rodriguez from Camp Pendleton. I'm the Marine who first shared your story on social media." Sarah felt her breath catch. She had heard about the sergeant's original Facebook post from the reporters who had interviewed her, but they had never spoken directly. "Sergeant Rodriguez, I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done. I had no idea that helping David would lead to all of this."
"Ma'am, with all due respect, you don't need to thank me. We should be thanking you."
What you did for Corporal Chen, that's exactly the kind of person we want taking care of our Marines when they're hurt. And the way that hospital treated you for showing compassion, that's just wrong. Rodriguez's voice carried the authority and sincerity that came from years of military service. Sarah found herself sitting up straighter, even though he couldn't see her.
I appreciate that more than you know, Sergeant. The support from you and your fellow Marines has meant everything to me during this difficult time.
Well, ma'am, that's actually why I'm calling. We've been talking with Marines from other bases, and we want to do something to show our appreciation for what you did.
Would you be available tomorrow morning around 10 o'clock? Sarah glanced at her calendar, which was surprisingly empty now that she wasn't working.
"Yes, I'm available. What did you have in mind?"
"We'd like to invite you to lunch, ma'am."
Nothing fancy, just a chance for some of the Marines whose lives you've touched to say thank you in person. The invitation was unexpected, but deeply moving. Sarah had been feeling isolated since her termination, spending most of her time alone in her apartment fielding phone calls and trying to figure out her next steps. The idea of meeting some of the people who had supported her was both exciting and nerve-wracking. "I would be honored, Sergeant. Where should I meet you?" "If you could come to the main gate at Camp Pendleton around 10 tomorrow morning, we'll take care of everything from there." "And ma'am, you might want to dress nicely. This is going to be a special occasion." After hanging up, Sarah spent the rest of the evening wondering what the Marines had planned. She chose her best professional dress, a navy blue outfit that she had worn to important hospital meetings and conferences. She wanted to look appropriate for whatever kind of gathering they had organized. The drive to Camp Pendleton took about an hour through Southern California traffic. As Sarah approached the main gate, she felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. She had never been on a military base before, and she wasn't sure what to expect. The guards at the gate were professional and courteous, checking her identification against a list and providing her with a visitor's badge.
"Ma'am, Sergeant Rodriguez is waiting for you at the visitor center," one of the guards informed her. "Just follow the signs and he'll meet you there." As Sarah parked and walked toward the visitor center, she noticed that there seemed to be more activity than usual around the base entrance.
Groups of Marines in their dress blue uniforms were gathered in various areas, and she could hear the sound of vehicles and conversations, though she couldn't make out what was happening.
Sergeant Rodriguez was waiting for her inside the visitor center, and Sarah recognized him immediately from the photos that had appeared in some of the news coverage.
He was a tall, imposing man in his 30s, with the bearing that came from years of military service, but his smile was warm and genuine as he approached her.
Martinez, it's an honor to meet you in person, he said, extending his hand. Thank you for coming.
The honor is mine, Sergeant.
I still can't believe how much support you and your fellow Marines have shown me. Ma'am, you're about to see that what we've done so far is just the beginning. Are you ready for lunch? Sarah nodded, and Rodriguez gestured for her to follow him outside. As they walked through the doors of the visitor center, Sarah stopped in her tracks, her eyes wide with amazement. Lined up in perfect formation stretching as far as she could see were hundreds of Marines in their dress blue uniforms. The formation extended down the main road of the base, with Marines standing at attention in rows that seemed to go on forever. At the front of the formation was David Chen, still on crutches but standing proud in his dress blues, a broad smile on his face. What? What is this? Sarah whispered, her voice catching in her throat. This, ma'am, is what happens when Marines want to say thank you, Rodriguez replied. Every one of these Marines volunteered to be here today. Some of them drove for hours from other bases. They all wanted to show you what your kindness means to us. As if on cue, the entire formation came to attention with a precision that took Sarah's breath away. The sound of hundreds of heels clicking together in unison echoed across the base like thunder.
Then, as one voice, the Marines began to cheer.
The sound was overwhelming. Hundreds of voices calling out, "Thank you, Sarah!" and "Hurrah!" filled the air. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she tried to process what she was seeing. These brave men and women who had dedicated their lives to serving their country had taken time out of their day to honor her simple act of compassion. David Chen broke from the formation and approached her, still managing to maintain military bearing despite his crutches. When he reached her, he came to attention and offered a crisp salute. "Ma'am, on behalf of the United States Marine Corps, thank you for showing us what true service looks like." Sarah was crying openly now, unable to speak through her emotions. The magnitude of the gesture was beyond anything she could have imagined. She had helped one Marine during a moment of pain, and now hundreds of his brothers and sisters in arms were showing her a level of respect and gratitude that left her speechless. Rodriguez gently took her arm and began walking her down the formation. As they passed each group of Marines, she could see the genuine appreciation in their faces. Some of the Marines were young, probably not much older than David. Others were veterans with decades of service, their uniforms decorated with ribbons and medals that spoke to their dedication and sacrifice. "These Marines come from all over Southern California," Rodriguez explained as they walked. "We've got people here from Camp Pendleton, 29 Palms, Miramar Air Station." When word got out about what we were planning, Marines started volunteering faster than we could organize them.
At various points in the formation, Marines stepped forward to speak with Sarah personally.
Some shared stories of nurses who had made a difference in their own lives or the lives of their family members. Others simply wanted to shake her hand and say thank you. Each interaction was brief but deeply meaningful. Master Gunnery Sergeant Williams, a 30-year veteran with multiple combat deployments, stepped forward as they passed his section of the formation. Despite his intimidating appearance and impressive array of military decorations, his voice was gentle when he spoke to Sarah.
"Ma'am, I've been in the Corps for 3 decades and I've seen a lot of people talk about supporting the troops.
But you actually did it when it mattered, when no one was watching. That's the real thing, and we don't forget people like you." As they continued down the formation, Sarah began to notice news crews positioned at various points around the base perimeter. The media had gotten wind of what the Marines were planning, and several television stations had sent crews to cover the event. Sarah realized that this demonstration of gratitude was going to receive the same kind of national attention that her original story had generated.
Take the car to while you...
At the end of the formation, a small stage had been set up with a podium and microphone. Colonel James Patterson, the commanding officer of the base, was waiting there in his dress blue uniform.
Sarah had learned from news coverage that Colonel Patterson had personally approved the unprecedented demonstration and had been instrumental in organizing the logistics. "Mr. Camper, Martinez," Colonel Patterson said as she approached the stage, "would you mind if I said a few words?" Sarah nodded, still overwhelmed by everything she was seeing. Colonel Patterson stepped up to the microphone, and the entire formation fell silent with military precision. "Marines, we are gathered here today to honor Miss Sarah Martinez, a civilian who exemplified the very best of American values when she risked her career to help one of our own. Miss Martinez, your actions remind us that service and sacrifice are not limited to those who wear the uniform. Your compassion,
your willingness to put the needs of others before your own well-being. These are the qualities that make our country strong.
The colonel paused, his eyes moving across the formation of Marines before returning to Sarah.
In the Marine Corps, we have a saying, Semper Fidelis, always faithful. You, ma'am, showed us what it means to be faithful to the principles of care and compassion that should guide us all. For that, we are eternally grateful.
The applause that followed was thunderous.
Hundreds of white-gloved hands came together in appreciation, the sound echoing off the buildings around them. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes as she tried to absorb the moment.
Colonel Patterson gestured for her to approach the microphone. Would you like to say something to the Marines, ma'am? Sarah hadn't prepared any remarks, but as she looked out over the sea of proud faces in dress blue uniforms, the words came naturally.
I never expected anything like this when I made the decision to help David, she began, her voice carrying across the formation thanks to the microphone. I was just a nurse doing what I thought was right for a patient who was suffering.
But seeing all of you here today, understanding how much that simple act meant to you, it reminds me why I became a nurse in the first place.
She paused, collecting her thoughts as she looked at the faces of the men and women before her.
You all serve our country with honor and courage every single day. You sacrifice for people you've never met, and you do it because you believe in something bigger than yourselves. What I did was nothing compared to what each of you does. If anything, I should be thanking you.
The Marines began applauding again, but Sarah raised her hand gently to continue. But I will accept your thanks and I will carry it with me for the rest of my life.
And I promise you this, whether I'm working in a hospital, a clinic, or wherever my nursing career takes me next, I will never forget that sometimes the most important thing we can do is show compassion to another human being who is suffering.
That's what you've taught me today.
As Sarah finished speaking, something unexpected happened. Without any command or signal, the Marines began to sing.
It started with a few voices in the front row, but quickly spread through the entire formation until hundreds of voices were joined in the Marine Corps hymn.
From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, the voices rose and fell in harmony, creating a moment of such profound beauty and meaning that several of the news cameramen found themselves wiping away tears as they continued to film.
Sarah stood at the microphone, overwhelmed by the honor of hearing these brave men and women sing for her. When the hymn concluded, Colonel Patterson returned to the microphone for one final announcement.
This is the book it's about history. 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 This is the book it's about.
Martinez, the Marines gathered here today have taken up a collection. We know that losing your job has created financial hardship, and we want to do something concrete to help. This is our way of showing that supporting the troops isn't just words, it goes both ways. He handed her an envelope, and Sarah could feel that it contained something substantial. Later, she would discover that the Marines had collected over $15,000, money that would help her cover her expenses while she searched for new employment. But the financial support, meaningful as it was, paled in comparison to the emotional impact of the day.
As the formation began to disperse and individual Marines approached to shake her hand and take photos, Sarah felt a sense of purpose and validation that she hadn't experienced since her termination. The media coverage of the event would prove to be even more extensive than that of her original story.
The image of hundreds of Marines in dress blue uniforms lined up to honor a fired nurse became iconic, shared millions of times across social media platforms, and featured prominently on national news broadcasts. The story was no longer just about a nurse who had been fired for showing compassion.
It had become a story about recognition, gratitude, and the power of people coming together to support someone who had done the right thing.
The Marines had transformed Sarah from a victim of bureaucratic overreach into a symbol of the values that many Americans felt were lacking in modern institutions.
As Sarah drove home from Camp Pendleton that afternoon, her car filled with flowers, thank you cards, and mementos that the Marines had given her, she felt something she hadn't experienced in days: hope. The demonstration had shown her that there were still people in the world who valued compassion and were willing to stand up for those who showed it.
But the Marines weren't finished yet. The success of the day's event had inspired them to think bigger, to consider ways they could ensure that Sarah's story had a lasting impact beyond just the immediate show of support. They were already planning their next move, one that would surprise Sarah and challenge the very institution that had fired her.
The war for Sarah Martinez was far from over.
In fact, it was just beginning. The video footage from Camp Pendleton spread across the internet like wildfire. Within hours of the ceremony, clips of hundreds of Marines honoring Sarah Martinez were being shared on every social media platform, viewed by millions of people who were moved by the display of gratitude and respect.
This place of the rest of the position that raised up and...
The image of Sarah standing before the formation in her navy blue dress, tears streaming down her face, became one of the most shared photos of the year. Mary's Regional Medical Center, James Carver was discovering that his problems were far from over. The hospital's phone system was completely overwhelmed with calls from people who had seen the Marine ceremony coverage. The hospital's Facebook page had accumulated over 10,000 negative reviews, and protesters were gathering outside the main entrance carrying signs reading, "Rehire Sarah" and "Compassion over Policy." Dr. Robert Hendricks, the chief of staff at St. Mary's, knocked on Carver's office door early Monday morning with a grim expression on his face. Hendricks had been at the hospital for 15 years and had weathered many administrative storms, but he had never seen anything like the public relations disaster that was engulfing them. "Jim, we need to talk," Hendricks said, settling into one of the chairs across from Carver's desk.
"This situation is spiraling out of control." Carver looked up from his computer, where he had been monitoring the continued negative coverage of the hospital.
Dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't been sleeping well since the story broke. "It's just media sensationalism," Carver replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "This'll blow over once people move on to the next story." "I don't think so," Hendricks said, pulling out his phone. "I've been getting calls from board members, major donors, and department heads all morning."
Everyone wants to know why we fired a nurse for helping a Marine, and frankly, I'm starting to wonder the same thing.
Hendricks showed Carver his phone screen, which displayed the hospital's patient satisfaction ratings from the previous quarter. Sarah Martinez had consistently received the highest scores from patients, with numerous written comments praising her compassion and professionalism.
"Jim, Sarah was one of our best nurses. Yes, she technically violated protocol, but she used good clinical judgment and helped a patient who was suffering. The medication she gave was completely appropriate and safe. Any reasonable person would have made the same decision." Carver shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The pressure was mounting from all directions, but his pride prevented him from admitting that he might have overreacted. "We can't run a hospital where employees ignore policies whenever they feel like it," he insisted. "If we back down now, what message does that send to other staff members? Maybe it sends the message that we value compassionate patient care over rigid rule following," Hendricks replied. "Jim, I've been getting calls from nurses threatening to quit if we don't reinstate Sarah. We're talking about losing experienced staff members who are impossible to replace in today's market." The conversation was interrupted by Carver's secretary, who knocked and entered with a worried expression. "Mr. Carver, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's someone here to see you who says it's urgent." "A Colonel Patterson from the Marines?" Both men looked surprised. They had seen Colonel Patterson's speech during the ceremony coverage, but neither had expected him to show up at the hospital personally. "Send him in," Carver said, straightening his tie nervously. Colonel Patterson entered the office in his service uniform, his bearing commanding even in the civilian environment of the hospital administration wing. He was accompanied by a woman in a business suit who introduced herself as Captain Lisa Rodriguez, the base's legal affairs officer.
"Gentlemen," Colonel Patterson said without preamble, "I'm here to discuss Ms.
Sarah Martinez and the circumstances surrounding her termination." Carver and Hendricks exchanged glances. They had expected media attention and public criticism, but a personal visit from a Marine colonel was something entirely unexpected.
"Colonel, while we appreciate your concern for Ms. Martinez, this is a personnel matter between the hospital and a former employee," Carver replied, trying to maintain his authority in the situation. "Actually, Mr.
Carver, it's become much more than that," Captain Rodriguez interjected, opening her briefcase and removing a folder. "We've been contacted by several veterans organizations who are concerned about the treatment their members might receive at this facility. Given that you terminated an employee specifically for providing aid to a Marine, there are questions about whether St. Mary's can be trusted to provide appropriate care to military personnel." She placed several documents on Carver's desk. As he glanced through them, his face grew pale.
"These are letters from the Veterans Administration, the American Legion, Veterans of Foreign Wars, and 3 other major veterans organizations," Rodriguez continued. "They're all asking for assurances about the quality of care their members can expect here.
Some are considering recommending that veterans seek care elsewhere."
Colonel Patterson leaned forward in his chair.
Mr. Joe Polito, Weapons for Competence. Carver, St. Mary's receives significant funding through military insurance programs and veterans benefits. If veterans organizations start recommending that their members avoid this hospital, what do you think that will do to your bottom line?
The implications were staggering.
St. Mary's received millions of dollars annually from treating military personnel, veterans, and their families. Losing that revenue stream would be devastating to the hospital's finances. Furthermore, Captain Rodriguez continued, "We've been in contact with the Nursing Licensing Board about this matter. They're reviewing whether Ms. Martinez's actions were within the scope of appropriate nursing practice.
Based on our consultation with medical experts, it appears that she acted responsibly and within accepted standards of care. Dr. TKCU, Dr. Private Society Sensor Technology, Dr. KCTK.
Hendricks spoke up. "Colonel, what exactly are you asking us to do?"
We're asking you to do the right thing.
Patterson replied simply, "Reinstate Miss Martinez with full back pay and a formal apology. Make it clear that this hospital values compassionate patient care and supports employees who use good judgment to help suffering patients." Carver's jaw tightened. "And if we refuse? Then you'll continue to deal with the consequences of your decision," Patterson said.
But I should mention that our investigation into this matter has turned up some interesting information. Captain Rodriguez opened another folder and removed a thick stack of papers.
"We've been contacted by current and former employees of this hospital who have shared their own experiences with your administrative policies. It appears that Ms. Martinez's termination is part of a pattern of prioritizing cost-cutting and liability concerns over patient care." She spread several documents across the desk. "These are affidavits from nurses who say they've been discouraged from spending time with patients, pressured to rush through care procedures, and threatened with discipline for going above and beyond basic requirements. One nurse was written up for staying late to comfort a grieving family member. Another was reprimanded for bringing a patient an extra blanket without authorization." The documents painted a picture of a hospital administration that had lost sight of its fundamental mission. Under Carver's leadership, St. Mary's had become a place where efficiency and cost control took precedence over compassionate care. "The story of Ms. Martinez has opened a lot of eyes," Colonel Patterson continued. "People are starting to ask questions about how hospitals are being run and whether patients are being treated as human beings or just as sources of revenue. You have an opportunity here to change course and demonstrate that this hospital still believes in its mission of caring for people." Carver sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the documents spread across his desk.
The weight of the situation was becoming clear to him. This was no longer just about one fired nurse. It had become a referendum on the hospital's values and priorities.
Dr. Hendricks cleared his throat. "Jim, I think we need to seriously consider the Colonel's request. The board is meeting tomorrow, and they're going to want answers about how we're going to move forward." "Dr. Psycho." "Hendricks is right," Patterson said. "This situation isn't going away, and it's going to continue to damage the hospital's reputation until you address it properly. Miss Martinez has shown remarkable grace under pressure, but she deserves better than this. You all do." After the Marines left, Carver sat alone in his office, staring out the window at the protesters who were still gathered in the hospital parking lot. For the first time since the crisis began, he allowed himself to consider that he might have made a serious mistake. The hospital board meeting the next day was unlike any in the institution's history. The boardroom was packed with physicians, nurses, and department heads who had come to express their views on the situation. Several board members had received hundreds of emails from community members demanding Sarah's reinstatement.
This is the book. It's about history and new services taking and taking thereafter today.
Board Chairman Dr. William Morris opened the meeting with a somber acknowledgement of the crisis facing the hospital. "We're here to discuss the termination of Nurse Sarah Martinez and its impact on our institution. Over the past week, this situation has raised serious questions about our policies, our values, and our mission as a healthcare provider." The discussion that followed was intense and emotional. Several nurses testified about the impossible positions they had been put in by increasingly rigid policies. Physicians spoke about the importance of allowing healthcare workers to use their professional judgment. Former patients shared stories about Sarah's exceptional care. Margaret Thompson, the emergency department charge nurse, stood to address the board. Her voice shook with emotion as she spoke.
"I've worked at this hospital for 20 years, and I've never been more ashamed to be associated with this institution. Sarah Martinez is exactly the kind of nurse we should be celebrating, not firing."
She represents everything good about healthcare, and we threw her away because she dared to show compassion to a suffering patient. The testimony continued for over 2 hours, with speaker after speaker defending Sarah's actions and criticizing the hospital's response.
By the time the public comment period ended, it was clear that the board had heard enough.
Doctor's dead. Good job.
Morris called for a brief recess, during which the board members deliberated privately. When they returned, Morris addressed the packed room with a grave expression. The board has reached a unanimous decision. Effective immediately, we are reinstating Sarah Martinez to her position with full back pay and benefits. We are also implementing a comprehensive review of our patient care policies to ensure that they support rather than hinder compassionate care. The room erupted in applause, but Morris raised his hand for silence. Furthermore, we are accepting the resignation of Mr. Febb, James Carver, as hospital administrator. The board believes that new leadership is necessary to restore the trust and confidence that this institution has lost. The announcement sent shockwaves through the room. Carver, who had been sitting at the back of the boardroom, stood up abruptly and left without comment.
His brief tenure as administrator had ended in complete failure, undone by his inability to understand that healthcare was about more than policies and procedures. Within hours, news of Sarah's reinstatement was spreading across social media and news outlets, with the same speed that her original story had traveled. The Marines at Camp Pendleton celebrated the victory as enthusiastically as they had supported Sarah during her darkest hours. Sergeant Rodriguez immediately called Sarah with the news, reaching her just as she was finishing dinner at her apartment.
Ma'am, I wanted you to hear this from us first. The hospital board just voted to reinstate you with full back pay. You won. Sarah sat down heavily in her kitchen chair, overwhelmed by the news. After a week of uncertainty and financial worry, she was going to get her job back. More importantly, the hospital had acknowledged that her actions had been appropriate. Sergeant, I don't know what to say. I never expected any of this when you first shared my story. Ma'am, you didn't expect it because you're a humble person who was just trying to do the right thing. But the rest of us could see what you couldn't, that your story was bigger than just one incident.
It was about standing up for what's right, even when it cost you everything. As Sarah hung up the phone, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment.
A week ago, she had been an unemployed nurse wondering how she was going to pay her bills. Tonight, she was a symbol of compassionate healthcare and a reminder that sometimes doing the right thing does get rewarded.
But Datchers can never employ change to competition, and a talent she has decided to no detection. So fortunately, the medical offices make him as manager effectively.
But the story was far from over. Sarah's reinstatement was just the beginning of a transformation that would affect not only St. Mary's Regional Medical Center, but hospitals and healthcare workers across the country. The movement that had started with one Marine's broken leg was about to change the way America thought about patient care. Sarah Martinez walked through the familiar automatic doors of St. Peterson.
Mary's Regional Medical Center on a crisp Monday morning, 3 weeks after her termination and 1 week after her dramatic reinstatement.
The building looked exactly the same, but everything else had changed.
As she made her way through the corridors toward the emergency department, she could feel the eyes of colleagues, patients, and visitors following her progress. Word of her return had spread throughout the hospital over the weekend. Some staff members had stayed late the previous Friday just to welcome her back, while others had left flowers and cards at the nurses' station. The story of her firing and reinstatement had made her a celebrity within the medical community, but Sarah was determined to return to work as the same dedicated nurse she had always been. Margaret Thompson was waiting for her at the emergency department entrance, her usual stern expression replaced by a genuine smile. The charge nurse who had once enforced rigid protocols with unwavering dedication had undergone her own transformation during the events of the past month. "Welcome back, Sarah," Margaret said, extending her hand. "We've missed you around here."
Thank you, Margaret. It's good to be back.
As they walked toward the nurses' station, Sarah noticed that the atmosphere in the department felt different. Staff members were moving with the same professional efficiency as always, but there was something lighter in their interactions, a sense that the oppressive weight of excessive oversight had been lifted.
"A lot has changed since you left," Margaret explained as they reviewed Sarah's schedule for the day.
The new interim administrator, Dr. Patricia Williams, has implemented what she calls compassionate care protocols. Essentially, they give nurses more discretion to use their professional judgment in patient care situations.
Dr. Williams had been brought in to replace James Carver, and her first priority had been to rebuild trust both within the hospital staff and with the community.
A veteran physician with over 20 years of experience, she understood that excellent patient care required empowering healthcare workers to do their jobs effectively. Sarah's first patient of the day was an elderly woman named Rose Chen who had fallen at home and injured her wrist.
This is the book. It's about its health and injured her wrist.
As Sarah helped her get comfortable in the examination bed and took her vital signs, she was struck by how natural it felt to be back in her element, providing care and comfort to people who needed help.
You're the nurse from the news, aren't you? Rose asked, studying Sarah's face with keen eyes despite her obvious discomfort.
Yes, ma'am, I am. Well, I want you to know that you did the right thing helping that young Marine. My grandson served in Iraq, and I know how much it means when people show kindness to our military boys and girls.
The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of David Chen, who had come to the hospital for a follow-up appointment about his fractured leg. When he saw Sarah, his face lit up with a smile that seemed to brighten the entire emergency department. This is not standing. This is the truth of happiness. Miss Martinez, I was hoping I'd see you when I came in today. Sarah was surprised to see him, though she realized she shouldn't have been.
As a patient being treated for his injury, he would naturally return for follow-up care. David, how are you feeling?
How's the leg healing?
Much better, thanks to you, he replied, indicating his walking cast. The doctor says I should be back to full duty in a few more weeks.
But I wanted to thank you again for everything you did, not just that day in the hospital, but for what you've accomplished since then. Their conversation was attracting attention from other staff members and patients, who recognized both of them from the extensive news coverage. Sarah felt slightly uncomfortable with the attention, but she could see that David's presence in the hospital was having a positive effect on everyone around them. Dr. Richardson, the physician who had treated David during his original visit, approached their conversation with a warm smile.
David, good to see you back for your follow-up.
And Sarah, welcome back. I have to say, what happened to you was completely unfair, and I'm glad the board made the right decision.
Thank you, Dr. Richardson. I'm just happy to be back doing what I love. As the morning progressed, Sarah found herself settling back into the familiar rhythm of emergency department nursing. She treated a construction worker with a deep cut, comforted a mother whose child had a high fever, and helped stabilize an elderly man experiencing chest pains. Each interaction reminded her why she had chosen nursing as her career, and why she had been willing to risk everything to help a suffering patient.
Around noon, Sarah was surprised to receive a phone call from Dr. Williams, the interim administrator, asking her to come to her office when she had a break. Unlike her previous summons to an administrator's office, this one didn't fill her with dread. Dr. Fess's Williams' office was completely different from the sterile, intimidating space that James Carver had maintained. The walls were decorated with photos of patients and staff, thank you cards from families, and certificates recognizing the hospital's community service efforts.
It felt like a place where healthcare happened, not just business. Sarah, please sit down, Dr. Williams said, gesturing to a comfortable chair across from her desk. I wanted to talk with you about your experience and what we can learn from it.
Williams was a woman in her 50s with graying hair and kind eyes that reflected decades of caring for patients. She had the bearing of someone who had never lost sight of why she entered medicine. First, I want to apologize on behalf of the hospital for how you were treated. What happened to you was wrong, and it reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of what healthcare should be about. Sarah appreciated the apology, though she was more interested in moving forward than dwelling on the past. Thank you, Dr. Saratic. Williams, I'm just glad to be back working with patients. That's exactly the attitude I was hoping to hear, Williams replied. Sarah, your story has had an impact that extends far beyond this hospital. We've been contacted by healthcare facilities across the country asking about our new policies and how they can better support compassionate care.
You've become a symbol of what nursing should be.
Williams pulled out a folder from her desk. I've received over 200 letters from patients you've cared for over the years.
Each one tells a story about how you made their experience better through your compassion and professionalism. That's the kind of nurse we want to celebrate and support.
She opened the folder and read from one of the letters. This is from Maria Santos, whose daughter you cared for during a severe asthma attack last year.
She writes, Nurse Martinez didn't just treat my daughter's medical condition. She treated our fear and anxiety. She explained everything in terms we could understand, stayed with us when we were scared, and made sure we knew we weren't alone.
She is exactly the kind of person I want caring for my family. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes as she listened to the letter. She remembered the Santos family and the long night they had spent in the emergency department, but she hadn't realized the lasting impact her care had made.
We have letters like this from hundreds of patients and families, Williams continued.
They all tell the same story. You go above and beyond not because you have to, but because you understand that healing involves more than just medical treatment. Williams closed the folder and leaned forward.
Sarah, I have a proposition for you. We're creating a new position here at the hospital, Director of Compassionate Care.
It would involve training other nurses and healthcare workers, developing policies that support patient-centered care, and serving as an advocate for both patients and staff when difficult situations arise. I'd like you to consider taking the position.
The offer was unexpected and overwhelming. Sarah had always been content as a bedside nurse focused on direct patient care. But the events of the past month had shown her that she could have a broader impact on how healthcare was delivered.
Dr. Williams, I'm honored by the offer, but I need to think about it. I love working directly with patients, and I'm not sure I want to move into administration.
I understand, and I want you to know that this wouldn't be traditional administration. You'd still spend time providing direct patient care, but you'd also help shape how we approach patient care throughout the hospital.
Think of it as being an advocate for the kind of compassionate care you've always provided. As Sarah returned to the emergency department, she found herself considering the unexpected opportunity. The position would allow her to influence how the entire hospital approached patient care, potentially preventing other healthcare workers from facing the kind of situation she had experienced. The afternoon brought a stream of patients, each presenting their own challenges and needs. Sarah found herself paying particular attention to the small moments of connection and compassion that occurred throughout her shift. A gentle touch on a frightened patient's shoulder, taking an extra moment to explain a procedure, staying with a family member who was receiving difficult news. These were the interactions that made healthcare meaningful. As her shift was ending, Sarah received another surprise visitor. Sergeant Rodriguez had come to the hospital, not as a patient, but to check on how her first day back had gone.
"Ma'am, I wanted to stop by and see how you were settling back in," he said, still maintaining the respectful demeanor that had characterized all their interactions. "It's been wonderful, Sergeant. It feels good to be back where I belong." "I'm glad to hear that. You should know that the story isn't over for us Marines either. We've started a foundation called the Sarah Martinez Compassionate Care Foundation.
It's going to provide grants to healthcare workers who go above and beyond for their patients, and scholarships for nursing students who demonstrate the kind of values you showed us."
Sarah was stunned by the news.
The idea that her story would continue to have an impact through a foundation dedicated to supporting compassionate healthcare was beyond anything she had imagined. The first grant recipient is going to be a nurse in Texas who lost her job for staying late to comfort a patient who was dying alone, Rodriguez continued.
The second is going to a paramedic in Ohio who used his own money to buy medication for a patient who couldn't afford it. Your story gave us the courage to speak up.
As Sarah drove home that evening, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this point. A month ago, she had been a dedicated but relatively unknown nurse working in a community hospital.
Tonight, she was returning home from her first day back at a job she had thought she had lost forever, having been offered a position that could amplify her impact on healthcare far beyond what she had ever dreamed possible. She thought about David Chen and his broken leg, the simple act of compassion that had started everything. She thought about the hundreds of Marines who had stood in formation to honor her, and the thousands of people who had shared her story because they believed in the importance of treating patients with dignity and kindness. Most importantly, she thought about the patients she would care for in the days and weeks ahead, and the healthcare workers across the country who might feel a little more confident about following their compassion because of what had happened.
When Sarah Martinez walked through those hospital doors the next morning, she would be carrying with her not just her own commitment to patient care, but the hopes and expectations of people across the country who believed that healthcare should be about more than just treating medical conditions.
DJ Linexer of Dr. Jefferson.
She would be representing everyone who believed that sometimes the most important medicine is simply showing another human being that they matter.
The young Marine with the broken leg had healed and returned to duty.
The nurse who had helped him had lost her job and gotten it back, along with a platform to advocate for compassionate care on a national scale. The hospital that had fired her had been forced to examine its priorities and recommit to its mission of caring for people.
But perhaps most importantly, healthcare workers across the country had been reminded that doing the right thing, even when it's difficult, is still possible.
Sometimes it costs you everything.
And sometimes when you're willing to pay that price, the whole world stands up to remind you what really matters. Sarah Martinez's story had become proof that compassion isn't weakness, that rules serve people and not the other way around, and that one person's willingness to do what's right can inspire countless others to examine their own choices and find the courage to follow their hearts.
In the end, they had fired the nurse for helping a Marine, but when the Navy, the Army, the Air Force, and countless civilians lined up to support her the next day,
Everyone learned something important about the power of standing up for what's right.
And Sarah Martinez learned that sometimes losing everything is the first step toward finding something even better.